In the city, everyone was talking about a supposed mansion that had suddenly appeared in the middle of the forest. Soon, such information reached the magistrate, who became curious about such news. After all, it was the first time he had been informed of the presence of a building in those surroundings. And a house built by ghosts certainly required a private visit. That night, the magistrate left the safety of his home, along with some of his officers. They advanced through the forest carrying torches, heading for the home of the most dangerous warrior in the land. Along the way, the soldiers discussed why the minister had not been in a good mood lately. The fact was that bandits were attacking the villages in the Ronan province. And the royal family had asked for this problem to be resolved as soon as possible. But it was not easy to deal with the sect of Mount Jangbak, the ones responsible for such events. The martial arts of its members were of the highest level, which made them difficult to capture in every aspect. They were also exceptional when it came to mastering their mounts, which allowed for a quick and efficient escape from stronger opponents. Because of this, the bandits' family members ended up being killed in retaliation. Thus, despite the situation having gotten out of control, the people had faith that the Imperial Guard would finish them off soon. Although it had been a year since the magistrate had been able to take a break, the conversation still continued when the chief's eyes filled with amazement. In the middle of that ghostly forest, something impressive was hidden. A huge and magnificent construction rose before the officers. It was so unlikely that the magistrate had to ask his companions if what he saw was really real. Everything in the mansion seemed well preserved and well structured. Some soldiers knelt down in fear. Then, they began to pray and beg for salvation. The only one who was sure about the human origin of the place was the leader, who was willing to go in to check everything. Until, suddenly, he felt a monstrous presence behind him. Despite the pressure and the deep fear he felt, he turned around. The protagonist had just returned from a hunt and was carrying a dead rabbit in one hand. Dan looked at us coldly, making it clear that he did not remember having invited anyone to his house. Scared, the magistrate asked if he was really the owner of the place. To which the demon responded positively. So, the chief tried to impose himself through his status, considering that the protagonist was just a countryman. But such a statement had no effect on Dan, who simply introduced himself afterwards. The administrator promptly asked if it was the warrior who would build the mansion. The god, however, said that he had only renovated a house that was already abandoned, which was not enough to fool the chief, who warned that no property could be built without permission. And then pressed his thumb against the peasant's chest, asking if he would continue to pretend that he did not know the law. But the protagonist looked at him with superiority and wanted to know why he could not receive permission at that moment. Immediately, the inert rabbit was thrown with great force and speed at the feet of the magistrate, who observed the dead animal without understanding what it meant. That's how it remained. Until the protagonist's dominant tone of voice made itself present. And the chief understood that this was an example of what could happen to him. Quickly ordering his soldiers to capture the man for his boldness. A single blow from Dan would be enough to kill all his enemies, but he preferred to be taken into custody to see what the others were capable of. Thus, the demon allowed the administrator to feel superior, even if only for a few minutes. The chief said that he would put Dan in a prison from which he would never leave alive. Although he was barely able to look the protagonist in the eyes, the group walked for a reasonable period until the military god's senses began to perceive a common movement. A short time later, one of the soldiers began to hear strange noises coming from the trees. He then shouted, asking who was nearby, but there was no answer. At least until a long arrow hit his neck. The man fell to the ground, dead. With that, everyone else went on alert, but it was too late. Hundreds of arrows crossed the sky in their direction. The soldiers watched the scene with pure terror. Despite their efforts, death was inevitable. One by one, the men were slaughtered. Only the magistrate and the prisoner remained, standing in front of the corpses, all with their bodies stuck to the ground, but already far away. The chief's gaze showed the panic that had taken over his mind. At the same time that a gorilla-sized man was humming with happiness, the leader of the culprits finally showed up. With bloodthirsty red eyes, he surrounded the magistrate. In front of that crowd, the minister was without any efficient defense. Cold sweat was running down his face without stopping, while the sect of Mount Jiangba was rejoicing at the proximity of their revenge. An evil smile took over the leader's face and, unlike the man at his feet, Dan remained impassive. The minister was about to deal with the consequences of his previous actions. He had not imagined that those deaths would be the cause of his torment. Then he turned his gaze to the prisoner. But it would not help him. His mind was elsewhere. Furthermore, the only weapon the judge carried was a sword. It would not be enough to face all those men, who were experienced in the most varied styles of martial arts. Thus, the administrator was quickly grabbed by the collar of his clothes. While the bandits swore him the most deplorable types of death. He raised his hands and asked for help. But all he received was a blow that shattered his necklace. For the leader of the gang, that was a day of celebration. He would greatly miss seeing the magistrate's terrified face, but the bandits had not come there just to have fun. After pulling the administrator by the head, he revealed with deep hatred that that was the day of his end, making the young judge sob in fear. Then, two bandits grabbed the magistrate by the arms and began to take him away. While he cried out for the protagonist's help, saying he would do anything. Then, one of the group members asked the leader about what should be done with that other Kara. But the old man didn't speak right away, because they barely noticed the man. So, he observed him and noticed the ropes that tied him. Understanding that he was a prisoner, he smiled. The old man then cut the bonds with a single blow, saying that Dan was lucky, which was repeated by the other bandits, who believed they had gotten him out of trouble. But the demon's gaze remained impassive. And the young minister was still crying, begging for help, which made Dan rethink his position, and then he asked the hairy leader to wait, leaving him extremely irritated with the nickname. The martial god then asked what they would do with the guy they caught. And they replied that they would do the same thing he had done to their families, kill him. Immediately Dan began to point out that the bandits had also killed some of his, irritating the leader even more. But he continued saying that, seeing it that way, he only took revenge for the dead. Such words caused an uproar among the gang, but the old man quickly silenced and soon asked if the protagonist would try to do something. Which was answered only with silence. Thus, for the first time the demon observed them carefully. Those men were in about 50 days. After the analysis, Dan asked if the magistrate wanted to live. If he did, he would have to comply with the condition of never returning to his property in the forest. Which made the criminals lose their tempers and start shouting once more. Remembering the huge mansion, the judge made a decision. He said that if he could be saved, he would definitely leave him alone. But he soon received a strong kick in the back and fell to the ground. With that, the demon took sides saying so be it. Which caused a huge wave of hatred in one of the ugliest among the evildoers, who gritted his teeth and prepared for the attack. He advanced with his right foot, cursing the martial god. And when his sword was already centimeters away from hitting the target, the blow failed. With a single movement from the demon, his enemy was destabilized. He was thrown at an unimaginable speed among his companions and ended up falling face down on the ground, foaming at the mouth. One of the best fighters of the group had been knocked out. Such an act scared everyone, including the local authority. Thus, the leader of the gang took on a serious tone. He had not been able to see Dan's movement. And wondered how he was being kept locked up. The guy in front of him was much stronger than him. But the criminals had an absurd numerical advantage, so they would not give up. They had already defeated more powerful enemies thanks to their numbers before. With that, the group began to surround him. While the old man smiled nervously, he thought it would be better to kill the warrior as quickly as possible. Thus, he ordered with loud shouts that all the members advance to kill him, although the demon's gaze only saw his next victims. Thus, thanks to the old man's resounding shout, everyone attacked. Dozens of men wielded their swords in full swing. And for a brief moment, a murderous thought crossed Dan's mind. Should he kill them? They were opponents who would die with a single goal. But the possibility of having to see so much blood again did not please the protagonist. He wanted a calm and pleasant life, but a decision needed to be made immediately. So he closed his eyes and acted. A huge explosion took over that clearing. The magistrate no longer knew how to react, and the chief bandit swallowed hard as he widened his eyes. In the middle of the smoke, it was possible to see the demon holding one of the men by the collar. With deep and dull eyes, like a predator. In less than a second, it was all over. After throwing the sword up in the air, Dan began to pick up several stones and threw them with impressive strength and precision against the enemies. The swords were shattered one by one, causing the members of the organization, as well as their weapons, to be completely annihilated. An ordinary person would not have been able to see any of those movements. It was something so inhuman that it caused goosebumps. The demon was at a combat level superior to anyone else. A single step towards Dan was the same as receiving an instant death pass. The moment the old man realized this, he cursed his opponent and started running. He ran desperately and using all his strength, leaving all his defeated subordinates behind. Dan watched the scene with disappointment and contempt. For the first time since his birth, the old man ran using the full capacity of his legs. It was a truly pathetic attitude, especially coming from someone with such a pose. But the minister shouted that no member could escape, especially the leader. So, he grabbed the protagonist's cloak and begged him to catch him. Dan's gaze showed his disgust for the cowardice. However, it was not in his nature to go after someone who ran away like a desperate little rabbit. But if he wanted to live in peace in the mansion, he would have to catch him. So, he decided to meet the judge's demands. Dan advanced through the air with unmatched speed. In an instant, he was next to the fugitive, who barely had time to notice the presence of the martial god. Before his hand came out of the shadows, it immediately grabbed him by the head and pushed him to the ground. The damage caused to the ground was depressing. Some time later, the magistrate had a blank look as he observed the ground. He had been hung from a tree by the protagonist, as well as the leader of the criminals. With that, the demon informed the judge that all the terms of the agreement had been fulfilled, causing the poor man to frantically nod his head in agreement. Dan made it clear that the consequences would be severe if any other issue was raised regarding the mansion. And the magistrate stated with all his strength that there would be nothing else for him to worry about, also guaranteeing that he would remain silent about anything related to the god. Seeing the administrator's tears, Dan remembered one of Somi's advice, which made him try to smile although the result was chilling. The hanging man trembled, thinking that it could only be a monster in disguise, and was determined to never come near that mountain again. Some time later, everything was going well in the Yeyang market. Dan and his little companion had decided to visit the city that day, and everyone was happily talking about the capture of the bandits. The demon was not pleased when he discovered that the girl, even in his company, did not feel safe in the forest. But the touch of his childish hand improved his mood. Then, a wonderful smell began to spread through the air. It came from a stall full of people, but the protagonist was lost in thought, evaluating the hardships they had already faced in the mountain. When he finally finished evaluating the main needs, he was surprised. Skewers of all types and flavors caught the attention of the pedestrians. Solemn's mouth was watering, while his eyes shone with interest. That was when Dan realized that one more thing was missing. He didn't have any coins. And to raise a child, purchasing power was essential. In reality, a very large amount of money was needed.